as Robert said, we served together on the Joint Staff and the J3, which is kind of the operations office for the Pentagon, serving both the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the combatant commands, and the Secretary of Defense. And we probably, in the year we were together, we probably spent more time, just because of the nature of the job, with each other than we did with our families. And over the course of that period of time, you kind of get to know somebody. But Robert went on to command 7th Fleet. And ironically, interestingly, he and my brother, who was a retired Navy captain, were counterparts in the U.S. Submarine Force. So as Robert said, I joined the Marine Corps in 1975. I went to the University of Virginia, and people asked me why I joined, and the answer is pretty simple. I needed a job, and I didn't get into law school, and I wanted to get married, and my parents were getting divorced, and I was broke. And I'd gone to OCS, and the Marine Corps offered me a commission, which I took with the anticipation I'd serve 3 years. I got married to my high school sweetheart, and we're still married. And then as things go, as you'll find out later, as you get older, 3 year turns into 6, 6 turns into 12, 12 turns into 25. And then, you're done 44 years later. So when Robert contacted me about engaging with UCSD, what do you want me to talk about? So we kind of came up with a topic of civil military relations, which at the time, a year ago, when I was on active duty, I left in the summer, about almost just shy of 2 years ago. I really didn't even, you thought about it, but hey, this is a democracy. The president of the United States, the commander in chief, the Congress holds the purse strings. You've got, a federal government, military does their job, provides best military advice, and you execute the orders to the best of your ability. But as I dug into this, more and more, I realized, well, there are some friction areas. There have been, there are today. There probably will continue to be some level of friction between the military and the government. And I came in the Vietnam era, and quite frankly, serving in the military was not exactly a preferred or desired occupation, because people at that time were very unhappy about a very unpopular war in Vietnam, 58,000 killed. And for many of them, they took it out on those that served. The great majority of whom were drafted and served without, they involuntarily forced to serve. So I started to dig into this and look into this, and quite frankly, the U.S. has a very interesting history, and I'm not going to don't have time or the capability or the expertise to give you a history lesson, but the U.S. has over the course of our history, there's been interesting engagements and dialogue between our civil leaders, our president and Congress, and the military. And I would just digress here to remind you that, Clausewitz, who, if you have not read and you're studying strategy of war, is probably worth your time. He reminded us back after the beginning of the 19th century that war is politics by other means. Generals and admirals don't go to war. Political leaders go to war in a democracy, and generals and admirals provide best military advice, and they do their very best to provide good guidance and recommendations, but the decisions are made by the political leadership. And so I just throw that out because I think all too often it's easy to say, well, what are those military guys doing? Well, hopefully we're doing what we were ordered to do and told to do after we had some input. And historically, you can go back and look at our nation. Lincoln in the Civil War went through a whole slew of generals, some of whom were incompetent, some of them like McClellan, who contested him, and some of them were just not very good until he found Grant. And I think the famous quote is, when the United States Army was stalled, in a fight, and they weren't doing anything, Lincoln asked the commander, do you mind if I borrow the army and do something with it, since you don't seem to be able to do anything? And eventually Grant became his commander, and Grant clearly, later on, became president of the United States for 2 terms. But Grant, he understood that the president of the United States was commander in chief, and he prosecuted the war in collaboration and coordination with President Lincoln. World War II is another interesting example. Franklin Roosevelt, at the beginning of the war, there really wasn't there wasn't even a secretary, or there wasn't even a Department of Defense. There was a War Department, and there was the Army and the Navy. There were no Joint Chiefs, let alone a combined Joint Chiefs with the UK and other allied nations. And General Marshall became kind of the de facto chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then after World War II, you have the National Security Act of 1947 that kind of lays out a Department of Defense with service secretaries and all that laid the groundwork, which was modified by the Goldwater-Nichols bill in 1986. And then fast forward, Truman becomes the president, and Douglas MacArthur is the commander in the Far East. And we are involved in a war in Korea. And after a huge, serious surprise and almost complete total disaster, we turn it around. And then MacArthur is not listening to what President Truman was saying. And he gets fired. And then comes back and makes this speech in front of Congress. Many people thought he was going to run for president, but he didn't. But Dwight Eisenhower ran for president and was elected. And so, how does this all work? And then Eisenhower probably becomes president. And we've had a number of presidents, and Vietnam, huge friction between the Joint Chiefs and Kennedy, and then with Lyndon Johnson, and then involvement. A good book to read about this is H.R. McMaster's book, Dereliction of Duty, where he's very, very critical of the military command structure, particularly the Joint Chiefs. I think it was General Wheeler was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and where he didn't speak up to the civilian leadership or even to the point where he may have resigned. So I could go on and on. You got Colin Powell. So you've had these people kind of move back and forth between the military side and the political side. Colin Powell, General Scowcroft, H.R. McMaster, Bud McFarland, people that served in the military, then ended up in the National Security Council as a national security advisor. We've had presidents that served in the military. The most recent being the younger Bush, and then obviously his father was a great World War II hero, and then you have John F. Kennedy, who's in the Navy in World War II. And so why is that important? I think that's important because at least if you have served, you have some idea what's going on. And it may shape your view, good, bad, or otherwise, on how you get your best military advice. So now here we are, lots of discussions. We've just had a change of administration. A lot of controversy over the fact that George Marshall was the first, prior to General Mattis, who got the waiver to serve in a cabinet position. General Marshall became the Secretary of State, and then General Mattis received the vote of Congress to become the Secretary of Defense. And now President Biden has gotten Lloyd Austin, another retired general, without the legally required 7 years. It's waiverable to serve in the SecDef position. And I bring all this up because if you follow this or pay attention to this, it doesn't concern me too much, although it does concern me some things about civil military relations. And there's an interesting article, and I talked to Admiral Thomas about this in Foreign Affairs. It's not in a published, it came out a week ago on the online version of Foreign Affairs, and I'm not advocating for or against Foreign Affairs magazine. I find that a lot of the articles are very interesting, and I do my very best now that I'm retired to keep up. But the authors, I'll try to be fair, they expressed a pretty significant concern about the involvement of military personnel in the government and the politics of the United States. And you like me, were disgusted and appalled by the events on the 6th of January, and there were a fair number of former veterans in that crowd. I'm not aware of anybody that was on active duty at the time, but they were retired. They're private citizens, and they're accountable for their actions regardless. But the previous administration, we had Secretary Mattis, General Mattis as the SecDef. We had John Kelly as the Director of Homeland Security and later the Chief of Staff. We had H.R. McMaster, who actually stayed on active duty. He didn't retire, and he was a national security advisor. And now we have Secretary Austin, and so service, and some people have a concern about that. Is the political side of our government becoming overly militarized? Is the military becoming over politicized? You've had retired general officers speak at political conventions. Uh, President Trump's first national security advisor was General Mike Flynn, who then had to resign. So is there a concern for our democracy about this? And I'll leave that to you. But there's kind of been some rules that we've learned. I mean, in the military, the battlefield is not a sterile place. The battlefield is a place where you're going to find all sorts of people out there doing their mission, from your government, State Department, USAID. You're going to find non-governmental organizations, and you're there to execute the policy and direction and orders of the government, of the commander in chief. And so uh, some of you may have served in the military before. Some of you may serve in the military in the future. Some of you may serve in the State Department or other forms of our government. And I would encourage you to consider that, as something to do to give back to your nation, because we need really, really good people to do that. But, what we've learned, what the Department of Defense has learned about dealing with the civil side is, we know who's in charge. I mean, the president's the commander in chief. If you travel to a foreign country, the senior U.S. representative there is the ambassador. The ambassador calls the shots, and so you go into the ambassador and you learn the lay of the land, and you follow the rules you're given. But in this relationship, whether it actually be in the federal government, in the interagency process, and Admiral Thomas is much more well versed in that than myself. Relationships matter. You have to trust each other. You have to recognize, particularly if you're in the military, that you're just not out there doing your own thing. The interagency is going to be on the battlefield, and they're part of the battlefield. Um, if you're going to do an operation like we've done, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, for example, and I'll talk a little bit about Somalia later, like Somalia or many of the humanitarian assistance operations we've done, you need to bring these folks in the planning from the beginning. The military has huge advantages. I mean, we have a logistical capability, we have a transportation capability, we have all sorts of things that we can do. But we're not designed or made specifically to do these type of operations, and we don't have the relationships with the nation that may be the recipient of this capability. So we need to coordinate with our interagency partners. We have to provide them liaisons. If you're in a military department like myself and Robert have been in, if you're in a senior position and you're doing stuff in an international basis, you have probably somebody from the State Department who's been seconded to you as a political advisor, and they may have contacts within the political side with our embassies all around the world or consulates. There's policies and messages. The U.S. military can sometimes come in with a little bit of a heavy footprint, even though we may not want to do that. And so you have to focus on the policy and the messaging. And I'll repeat what I said about the ambassador. The ambassador is a senior U.S. representative in that particular government. I mean, the government is sovereign, but as far as the United States is concerned, nothing is going to happen or should happen or will happen in most cases without the ambassador of the U.S. ambassador of that country giving his or her approval. I've seen some of my friends learn this lesson the hard way. I don't know if Admiral Thomas remembers Ambassador Kinney down in the Philippines. I mean, the first thing you did when you went to the Philippines, you went to Manila and you went to see her, and before you did anything else, because otherwise you were going to hear about it and it was not going to go well. I mean, she clearly was, in charge down there, and that's fine. I mean, we all know that. And besides that, you need to go to the embassy because the embassy has much more knowledge than you do about the history of the country, the culture of the country, the politics of the country, what's a pertinent issue, what are all the things, what's the status of forces agreement, if there is one, what's the relationships, what political things are going on, what other nations are working there in the country that might be helpful or a hindrance to you So we've learned all that, and now we just have to execute. So again, it's kind of the list is gain trust. You express your view, but you have to be careful about what you say publicly. You try to anticipate. You always want to under promise and over deliver. And you want to try to anticipate what you have to do. Now, one of the things on the Paul Mill side that's come under increasing scrutiny and discussion is what's the role of retired military? What do you do when you're retired and you're technically a private citizen? How active should you be in politics? And you may have seen prior to this election that for both candidates, there were a number of senior officers that signed letters saying, I recommend you vote for this person, or you recommend you vote for that person. Some of them were my friends. I did not do that because my personal view, and this is my personal view, is that's not the role of a retired military officer. When I was on active duty, I did not express publicly my political views. I'm a US citizen. I have my personal views, but they're not for public discussion. I keep that to myself, and it certainly never enters the workplace. And we've seen that. I saw it before I left. People who, whatever reason, social media allows people to express a lot of opinions where they think they might have some level of anonymity. But it was very simple to me. If I caught you on active duty, stand in front of a group of Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen expressing your personal political views, then we were done. You were going to get fired because that's against the law. We don't do that. We follow orders. We follow lawful orders and carry them out to the best of our ability. Now, then you get to the question of, okay, what do you do if you get an order that's unlawful? Or, that's easier if it's unlawful, like to kill a prisoner or to violate the law of war or to do something. What do you do if you just disagree? What do you do if I think that's a bad idea? Well, you get orders and orders are to be carried out. And if they're not an unlawful order, they don't violate some law or rule, and the military, like everybody else, is accountable and operates under rules and laws and policies. You just are not running around out there doing what you want to do when you want to do it. It just doesn't work that way. But if somebody gave you an order that was maybe a change in policy that you just for whatever reason couldn't agree with, you always have the right to resign. You always have the right to resign. Secretary Mattis resigned. He resigned because he disagreed. He resigned because he didn't believe that his best military advice was being adhered to. I'm not going to quote him. You can read his letter of resignation that he wrote to the president. I have more inside information as to why he did that, but I think he just felt like, hey, I'm here to provide best military advice. But if you're providing best military advice to somebody who you don't believe is at least going to consider it, I'm not saying they agree with it or not, then he decided to step down. And so that was his decision. Now, on the other side, if you're a civilian working with the military, it is a different culture. It's not exactly like the Klingons in the Federation on Star Trek, but it can be, we see things in a different way. And just like we need to understand what's happening on the political side and the diplomatic side, you need to try to get to know the military. And it's a mutual respect thing. In many cases, the military needs the support of the political side or the civilian side. And try to keep things out of politics. One of the things I adamantly agree with in this article in Foreign Affairs is the idea of not allowing a political leader to use U.S. troops as a backdrop for a political speech. What do you do? It just never seems to go well. And people on both sides of the aisle have done this. They want to wrap themselves, my words, not theirs. They want to look patriotic and they want to look like they support the military. So they go to a base or an installation. They have a crowd of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines there, and they give their speech and they got the big American flag. And what are the troops supposed to do? Applaud? Not applaud? Yell, cheer, not be quiet, sit there? We're supposed to be apolitical. And so I do agree with them for a politician to do that. It's not an unlawful order, and I've seen it happen with a number of senior leaders. But it puts the military in a kind of an untenable situation. Now, just like President Truman, if the military does something you disagree with, or they're not following orders, or they're not in compliant with the policy, you need to hold them accountable. You've got authorities as a civilian leader, and so you should exercise them. And when we get confirmed to hold a 3 or 4-star post, and Rob will remember this, the Senate Armed Services Committee sends over a letter, and they say in the letter, do you agree that when you are asked a question, you will provide the truthful, I can't remember the exact words, Robert, but you will provide your best military advice and answer the question to the best of your ability. So you say, yeah, sure, I'll do that. But then you get in front of the hearing and they'll ask you, well, do you agree with vice president or SecDef or president's policy? Well, I'm not going to answer that. Well, you were at the meeting when this was said. Do you recall that? I mean, meetings that are held with senior political leaders that's not something I'm going to discuss in an open hearing. I might discuss it in a classified hearing, or it might be a classified thing. And I'm not going to do that in a public setting. Clearly our adversaries, and I do it for a practical reason, clearly our adversaries watch the discourse that takes place in a democratic society. That we're open, we speak our minds, we say what we want to say, but they are going to message that there's dissension and or disagreement between the military and the political or the executive and the legal side. I mean, so you don't want to go there, and you don't need to talk about things. At a readiness hearing, for example, you're talking about the actual readiness of the force. That should be done in a classified setting without the media there and without anybody able to see it, because the readiness level of the force is something that clearly our adversaries would take as advantage. So I'm in about 25 minutes. Let me just talk about a couple personal examples, and then we'll see if there's any questions. So probably my first experience with this was in 1988. I got ordered to the Panama Canal Zone at the time. The United States had signed the Panama Canal Treaty. President Carter, another former military member, he was in the Navy. He and then President Torrijos of Panama had signed the Panama Canal Treaty, giving back the Panama Canal Zone to the country of Panama over a period of time. And then on December 31st, 1999, it was going to transition entirely to the government of Panama. And the U.S. had a military presence down there. And we have a history of, the U.S. If you read David McCullough's book, Path Between the Seas, which is, besides just educating you about the Panama Canal, it's just a really good read, and McCullough's a great writer. But at the time, there were the Panama Canal Zone was at one time sovereign U.S. territory. If any person was born at Gorgas Army Medical Center in Panama City, you were in the zone and you were an American citizen. And there were a large number of American expats living down there. And so a guy named Manuel Noriega was the leader of Panama. He was violating the Panama Canal Treaty as far as where he would go and where we could go. And there was huge tension, and President Bush, after a number of discussions and a coup attempt against Noriega and a reinforcement of Americans and the Noriega's disavowal of the 1988 election, or the 1989 election, excuse me, when he clearly lost the election, but he just declared himself the winner. We were involved in all sorts of things to try to exercise what we were calling our freedom of treaty rights. And there was a combatant commander down there, Southern Command, which is now in Miami, was headquartered there. And there were a number of people that were in senior leadership positions that the Marines that were down there, myself included, felt that they were a little bit too accommodating to the Panamanian government. And so there was tension. There was actually tension within the military, within the U.S. military. And there was some tension about the policy of the U.S. government that we and our families, I had my family down, that we were being put in a position of unnecessary risk. And so we had the commanding general from the East Coast of the United States for U.S. Marine Corps, a guy named Ernie Cook, Lieutenant General Cook, came down to see us. And he got all the officers together. And he said this: I understand you have some frustration with the rules and policies that you're being required to operate under. And I understand that. But let me just say this: if you can't exercise complete and total execution of the orders that you're given, all you need to tell me and I'll get you out of here. That's it. Because if you can't do the job the way you're supposed to do the job, I don't need you down here. So just tell me afterwards and I'll get your orders on. And everybody kind of sat there and looked around the room, looked at their shoes or their boots. And to the best of my knowledge, nobody ever said another word about it. So General Cook was exercising proper civil military relations. Hey, you're in the military. You got your orders. Do your job and shut up. But I'm giving you a way out because I understand your frustration. So just come tell me, and I'll no harm, no foul. I'll get you out of here. I mentioned Somalia. So in the I think it was November of 1992, there was a belief of a huge famine in Somalia, and President Bush, who had just lost the election to Bill Clinton, decided that it would be a good and noble thing to send U.S. military into Panama or into Somalia to do a humanitarian assistance disaster relief operation. And little did we know. I mean, we knew there'd been a civil war there. We knew the country had been, kind of become a non-ungoverned space. So we go in there, thinking we're going to hand out, food and help people. And we didn't realize that there was no security, there was no infrastructure, there was none of the things that Maslow tells us have to exist in order for people to live safely and securely. They have to be safe, they have to have food, they have to have shelter, they can't get robbed, they can't be imposed upon by some external force. We ended up being that external force. And so we thought we were going to go there and hand out food. We ended up in a gunfight for a while. And President Bush came to see us. To his credit, I think he was trying to do a good thing. And quite frankly, what we were doing actually worked for a while. And there were a number of militias and different groups there that were vying for power, just like they are now. You've got the government of Somalia, and I think you've got Al-Shabaab is the other group that's in there, and they're still fighting. It's tribal, and it's be very, very difficult for anybody from the United States to kind of undo that. But the people are suffering, and so we went there and did was a good thing. Now, ironically, it was the UN took over the operation, and led by a Navy admiral. I can't think of his name. He was retired. He became the UN Special Representative of Somalia. And if you remember how the story goes, if you ever watched the movie Black Hawk Down, the number one tribal leader, a guy named Ideed, ended up attacking a bunch of Rangers that were trying to capture a guy in a place called the Bakara Market. And the whole thing kind of went south. And President Clinton ended up pulling everybody out. And so, you find yourself sometimes, whether you agree with the policy or not, you do the best you can. In this case, the United States lost some prestige because I don't think we really understood the policymakers. And again, I don't know what was going on or what was being told by my senior leaders. I remember when we got the orders to go there. I mean, it was on Thanksgiving in 1992, and I'm sitting there with my wife and our kids, and I'm like, there's no way we're going to go to Somalia. Nobody in their right mind would send us to Somalia. Why am I going to go to Somalia? And then a week later, I'm landing at Mogadishu International Airport. I'm like, all right, good morning, Somalia. Good morning, Mogadishu. You see the Paul Mill piece in Bosnia, President Clinton, the United States finally intervenes, try to get out the UN Protection Force. We end up doing a bombing campaign. And then there's the Dayton Peace Accords, and then follow on with that. So, there were those that, and whether you agree with that or not, the military went in, they were the political arm of the policy decision, and they had created a stable, peaceful environment in what used to be called Srpska, Republic of Srpska, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. I visited there. I mean, and that's a piece that's still holding. They're down in Kosovo, another extension of where the Serbs lived. This was after the fall of the Soviet Union. So the Russian military, albeit what it was at the time, it was post-Soviet Union. So politics matter. Iraq, I spent a year in Anbar province in Iraq. And quite frankly, we didn't have a lot of civil military relations with the US government because we didn't have very many US government people that were coming out there. We did have a lot of civil military relations with Iraqis in our efforts to try to get them to stand up a local and provincial government. And you get in this discussion, is the US military a nation building force? And again, there's a policy decision. Is that what we train the US military to do? Can they do it? Are they good at it? Are they the right force? Do they have the right capacity? Same thing in Afghanistan. Discussion today. The previous decision of the previous administration was we're going to be out of Afghanistan on the 1st of May. President Biden basically says, no, I don't think we're going to do that, but we're not staying forever. Okay, that's a decision. And those of us that have served in both of those places, it's difficult to be objective about whether to stay or go because we've had very close friends, or we've got emotional scar tissue associated with that. But when you're providing best military advice to the political leadership, you have to kind of put that to the side. I've been a service component to a combatant commander. I was a Marine component commander to both General Mattis and General Austin in Central Command. And in that place, my job was to go around and make sure that the Marines that were there were trained in doing their mission, and also to engage with the host nation. So I had the opportunity to travel, visit with all our embassies, all our ambassadors. And I will say this, General Mattis, when he was at CENTCOM, he did some really smart stuff. I mean, we would meet quarterly in Qatar at Al Udeid Air Base, and at least twice a year, he would bring in all the ambassadors of all the Middle Eastern countries to meet with us, to develop that trust, to develop those relationships, to get a better understanding of what was going on in all these countries. Because we needed them to help understand what was going on, and they needed us because we gave them a certain amount of leverage and clout when they dealt with their host nation counterparts. And then I mentioned hearings up on Capitol Hill as a service chief. Your job is to go up there and answer the questions of the members, or your job is to go across the river to the White House and participate in deputy committee meetings, or meet with the National Security Council, National Security Agency, or even the president themselves. And you're asked to give your best military advice or provide information. I mean, the decision rests with the president of the United States. And even in the Pentagon, the senior representative of the Department of Defense is the Secretary of Defense, a civilian. So I believe there are some people who have some trepidation about that being a military person. To me, I think that anybody in that job understands that what their job is, whether they've been a general or an admiral, or they've served before or not. So we've had all sorts of people serve in that, and they've all done, I mean, Secretary Gates, Secretary Carter, Secretary Esper, Secretary Weinberger, Les Aspin. I mean, they come from all walks of life, and whether they were military or not, I mean, they knew what their job was. And it's the job of the military to, provide them best advice on recommendations so that they can make the best recommendation, or if it's within their prerogative to make a decision on what we're going to do. So it's something worth looking at. The first time I heard the word civil military relation, I thought about, well, what's the relationship of the United States, the people in the United States, to the military? And I'll just leave this before there's any questions. I got 12. I'm not sure if they're in the chat, but when we went to the all volunteer force, the number of people in this country that served as a percentage of the population went way down. I think right now we're like 1% to 2% of people have served or have a family member that served or even know somebody that served. And so I don't think that's good. But at the same time, the United States made a decision after the Vietnam War that we were no longer going to have a draft. We still have the selective service where you have to register, but we don't draft. Now, one consequence of that, in my opinion, again, it's made the force very expensive, very expensive. And it's going to continue to get more expensive, which when you talk about the budget of the Pentagon, the great majority of the money for the Marine Corps, almost 70% of the Marine Corps budget goes to pay salaries. So if you want to modernize and you're looking for cash, you can cancel legacy programs, but you're really going to have to cut the size of the force if you're not going to increase the budget. So, the American people, we have to, it's great when everybody says, thank you for your service, thank you for your service. And I believe they're sincere, but do they really understand what we do or what we've done or what we're going to do and what the commitment is and what it does to our families? And thankfully, we don't have, people getting killed or grievously wounded anymore like we did from 2002 to probably, it's been a while. I mean, any casualty is a tragedy, but that's part of the business, I have to say. I mean, everybody knows going in that you're always going to be at risk. So I think this is something that's worthy of a discussion amongst yourselves. And I appreciate the opportunity to bring up a few points, and then I'll go ahead. And so I'm not sure, Robert, how do you want to do, or Dr. Kartze, how do you want me to do the question? Just click on the chat and then take the question.
Yeah, so what we'll do, General, is, well, first of all, let me thank you for a kind of an unvarnished tour de force for those who have taken my U.S. national security decision-making course, especially this last winter quarter. People like Rummer Burston there, I could see them on the net and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, General Neller just covered in about 40 minutes, Thomas, what it took you 10 weeks to cover. So I just think you've really put enough of the practitioners' data out there, this perspective you have that's absolutely unique for us. I've never seen the chat for one of our speaker series so active. There's so many people up on the net that have personal experiences just like you do, and so I see the pushing and shoving on chat, which is absolutely healthy. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of ask the first question, then I'm going to ask Professor Gartsky to ask the second one, and then I'm going to go back through as you're answering. We'll go back through the participants list, and we'll see how we kind of, Christine and I'll try to manage the questions from there, if that's all right. Okay.
Sure, that's great.
Yeah, so right there at the last, you talked about the all-volunteer force. You and I have talked about this before, and it kind of goes to a little bit of the historical background you provided up front. This idea of national service, not even military necessarily, but do you think that's worth the debate and the political capital to have this idea of national service so that you get back into this idea of everybody having skin in the game? Because it appears to me that the commander-in-chief, the chief executive, the president, gets kind of a pass on using the military for things that frankly it's probably not designed for, because there are so few people with skin in the game. Your thoughts on that?
Well, on the national service, I've had somebody ask me if I would wanted to write about this, and because I do think the cost of the force and the benefits of the force, the things we have to do to entice people to join and then to get them to stay, is, and again, my personal opinion is it is close to being unaffordable. Now, as far as the military being asked to do so, I'm looking at some of the chat things. Uh, Actually, we didn't invade the Panama Canal. We were already had our inherent right to be there by law, and we were just reestablishing our rights under the existence of the Panama Canal Treaty. And then when the government of Noriega, it delegitimized itself by not allowing an election, it was a political decision. We did invade and put the group that won the election, Calderon and Billy Ford and I'm trying to think of Gilmer and Dara, I think was the guy's name. He put him. It was a tri-presidency. We put him in office, and then we left. We left. And then there's a comment, we didn't do a good thing in Somalia. I don't know. I kind of thought the people that we gave food to thought it was a good thing. You know, but again, it goes back to Admiral Thomas's question: is the military the right force to do this? Are we the one that's going to reestablish a duly elected, competent, secure, capable government? Probably not, because that's not what we were trained to do or educated to do. But if not us, who's going to do that? The State Department and the other elements of the U.S. government, they just don't have the capacity to do that. And so then the question is, all right, so should you have gone in the first place? Should you have gone just, should we have just allowed ourselves to continue to see, like we see every night on TV, places where people are starving and children are suffering? And when you think, well, we ought to do something about that. What do we want to do? So, it's a difficult question. I think it was Madeleine Albright that, kind of said, we've got this wonderful army, this great military that we spent all this money. We won the Cold War because the Soviet Union, disintegrated. So what are you going to do? Can you mind if we use it for something else? And in some places it's worked okay. In other places, it's probably been less successful. So those are all policy decisions that were made, and in the military, and I mean I can only speak for the Marine Corps, but in the military, did we make mistakes? Yes. But I don't think we went in there. We tried to do our very, very best with the capabilities we had just to accomplish the mission. So, I mean, that's a political decision. Is the military, what are we going to use it for? How big does it need to be? What's its purpose? How long, you hear the term never ending wars. Well, we've been in Germany and Japan since 1945 at the express desire of those particular governments. And we left Iraq in 2011 because the Iraqi government asked us to leave. And then in 2014, when ISIS came in, they asked us to come back. And if they ask us to leave again, we'll leave. And the current government in Afghanistan has asked us to stay. The Taliban want us to leave. Well, they're not the government yet. So again, political leadership establishes policy, makes decisions, and the elements of national power execute those orders to the best of their ability.
Thanks, General. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start to go through the hand raise crowd, and then we'll have Professor Gartsky actually put a bow around it right on the hour. So Ryan Zahid, over to you.
Yeah. So General, you mentioned putting personal experience aside when advising. I was curious to know if you found that there were any other specific challenges involved with consulting or advising for political officials who may have different experiences from, let's say, a military member.
Well, it depends on what the question is they're asking me. Again, normally it's, if you get asked, what's your thought on that? And normally when I would visit a country, when before I left, I would go back to the ambassador or the embassy and say, okay, here's who I met with, and this is what they said. And they would many times use the military person as a messenger, express their displeasure with the policy there. I mean, I went to one country and we had withheld the sale of, we had withheld the delivery of 10 military items, 10 military programs that they had already paid for because we were politically dissatisfied with their actions against certain parts of their population. So I got to go meet with their senior military person and get harangued and beat up for 35 minutes about that policy because they knew I couldn't do anything about it, but they knew I would have to go back and express that view to my hires. So, you do your very best when you're talking with your own political leadership, to if they ask you, here's what about this, here's something we could do. You say, offer, well, we might be able to do this, or they, or you have an open and candid conversation, but you're not making policy, you're executing policy. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Tino, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, General. I just had another quick question. If you could expand on kind of the role of public relations and public opinion, especially with recruitment in the military. I was reading like an article that the UK was trying to recruit like people going to the gym and people addicted to their phones and to try to turn them into like a life of service. And if you, especially in a time now when I think so many university students feel kind of disconnected from the military and don't directly kind of see the work they do, to what extent do you think public opinion and a recruitment drive is important going into the future?
Well, as long as we have an all-volunteer force, we're going to have to convince, people like you to consider service in the military. And, you'll see the ads on TV. And for the recruiters, I mean, our target audience is, there is a different experience to try to recruit somebody who's going to university than it is to recruit somebody who's coming out of high school. But we need both. So for you to become an officer, you have to decide, yeah, I'm interested in serving in the Marine Corps. We're going to try to convince you that, you want to earn the title of Marine officer. And that's something that whether you, put on your resume, get the experience of leading young men and women, that's something that you're interested in, and maybe get to do some travel. So the COVID thing has made recruiting really hard, particularly I think for the high school market, because normally you want to visit. And I think we're social people, we're social beings. We want to have some level of human contact. I want to look you in the eye, you want to look me in the eye. And it's just not the same on a Zoom call. So it's made it hard. But at some point, I mean, somebody's got to do this. We're not going to hire non-citizens to fight or to be in our military. It's part of, so I mean, if it gets to the point, if you've ever read the book Starship Trooper, you may have seen the movie, which is a really poor rendition of the book. The guy Robert Heinlein, in the book, the society that exists on Earth at the time, they've gone through a process in their history, and quite frankly, the bottom line is, in order for you to be a citizen and vote and own property, you have to have served. Okay, it doesn't necessarily have to be the military. Anybody, no matter if you're disabled or whatever, if you want to serve, if you want to be a citizen and vote and own property, you serve, you join and do your time in the government. And a lot of countries still do that. Israel does that. South Korea does that. But the UK went away from a draft like we did, and now they're experiencing the difficulty of getting people when there's so many opportunities in the civil side and the commercial side. They're finding it difficult. But I just pose this question to you: is that okay? So if we're going to continue to be a global leader and maintain security for our nation and our markets, who's going to do this?
General, I'm going to turn it over to, and I'll apologize if I mispronounce this, Sora Hope.
Thank you. It was close to Sora Hub, but thank you so much. So I just had a comment and a question. So my uncle actually is a general in the Korean military, and he like mentioned you. So this is like so like cool for me. So thank you so much for coming, General Neller. And then my question was, so since you served in the Marines, I was just wondering like, do you have like when you first joined, like, do you have a like, or are you allowed a preference? Like, oh, like Marines versus like Air Force, or like, I'm just wondering. And then like, how did you personally choose like, oh, I want to serve in the Marines?
Yeah, I mean, anybody, if you had a curiosity about being an officer in the military in this country, or I'm not sure if you're still a Korean Republic of Korea citizen. I mean, in your country, the young men, they still have mandatory obligated service.
Yeah.
And so, but clearly you have the choice. And so I want to go, I'm interested in the Air Force. I'm interested in this. I mean, quite frankly, if you were interested in being a medical professional, particularly like a doctor or nurse, the military is the best way to go because they'll pay for your whole school and you'll come out debt free. Now you'll have to serve. You probably have to end up do like 10 years to pay it back, but you know, here you are, you get all this practical experience. But yeah, you pick, and then once you're in, then you have some input as to what occupational area that you end up in. But a lot of it has to do with your test scores. And do you still speak Korean?
Yes, I do. I'm fluent.
Okay, so we're very interested in you.
Oh, great.
Because for non-native speakers, the Hangul language is the most difficult to learn. So just keep that in mind. So the State Department, the CIA, everybody out there, if you're interested in that, they would love to have you because you speak and read and write Korean. Anyway, but yeah, you get a choice.
Thank you.
One more question, then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Gartsky, and I apologize for not being able to get to everybody. This is probably the most active chat and question and answer period that we've had in a while. So General, a warning, I'm going to ask Julie Choi to ask a question, but she's also married to a Marine, so be careful.
Thanks for outing me there, Robert. Good morning, General. My name is Julie Choi. As Robert said, I'm married to a former enlisted Marine. I wanted to get your opinion on, the disconnect or divide I've noticed between the enlisted side and the officer side. As you said earlier, the officers tend to be a little bit more reserved in their political opinions, but on the enlisted side, it's a bit of a different story. So I'd be interested to get your opinion on that.
Well, first on the political thing, I don't care if you're officer or enlisted, your personal views, and they don't come into the workplace, and you don't have the authority or prerogative to go on social media while you're on active duty and express that. You don't. Just like you don't have the prerogative to go on social media and make disparaging comments about somebody or post disrespectful or compromising pictures of them. It's a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And if you are caught, you will be held accountable. So on the other side, I think the relationship between an officer and the enlisted side is supposed to be that, and our senior leaders, I got John A. Lejeune was a commandant of the Marine Corps in 1920, and he wrote a lot about this because, this isn't about higher or lower or superior or subordinate. I'm the coach. You're my player. I'm the teacher. You're my student. I used to tell the Marines, well, I'm not your dad, but actually, I am kind of like your dad. So I'm going to give you advice. And you may not like what I tell you, but I'm never going to lie to you. So at the same time, I think officers who understand that, they're there to share the risk with those that they lead. Officers, who make those that everybody knows you're the officer. Everybody, you've got staff non-commissioned officers, you've got NCOs, you've got junior Marines. if everybody thinks everybody else is looking out for each other and they give a shit, usually that stuff goes away. It really does. And so I'm not perfect. Robert's not perfect, you know, and and I don't know anybody that's perfect. But if you're good, if you're an officer that, you know, if I went up to your husband's Marines when he was in his unit and, you know, I'd say, what do you think about your lieutenant? And they go, well, yeah, the lieutenant. I mean, I think the lieutenant cares about it. You care about the mission, but the lieutenant cares. He's not out. He's here for the right reasons. Okay, then we're good. So it's like in any organization, you know, where do people want to work? They want to work where they have an opportunity to excel, have an opportunity to be recognized, have an opportunity to advance, and where they think that people that are in positions of authority and supervisory capacity are going to listen to them and make sure that, you know, they get the input, they get to make input when they're able to, but they also want to believe that, you know, they actually care about me as a human being, you know. And if so, you know, I've seen really good units, and in good units, that's the way it is. It's a team. It's a buy-in. I got to convince you that, you know, I'm going to look out for you and take care of you, make sure you get paid, get good equipment, and your gears and, you know, your gears in shape, and I'm not going to do anything to embarrass you, and I'm going to be as professional as I can be. Your job is to show up every day, be sober, you know, work hard, be physically fit, and and do your job. Just do your job. It's easy to lead people that are motivated. You know, I mean, even crappy leaders can kind of muddle through on that. And I think for the most part, I mean, most people want to. I mean, I'm kind of a stoic idealist. I believe most people want to do the right thing. And there's a few that are out there that don't want to do the right thing, and they're dangerous, and we need to get rid of them. So tell your husband thanks for his service. What did he do as a Marine?
He was a 2651 in 1st Radio Battalion.
Okay. So you're guaranteed a place in the afterlife because you married a Marine.
Which side?
Whatever side, the good side. The good side. Well, it depends. Hopefully not the dark side. Should be the good side.
All right.
No, it depends on the enlisted.
Okay, so I'm going to call an audible, and Awais Awari, I apologize for probably mispronouncing your name. I'll get that as a question, then Professor Gartsky, and then we'll put a bow around this. Over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for taking my question. General, I just have a question. Like, I mean, me personally, I'm from Iraq, from Anbar province, and actually, I have family even in Fallujah. And I remember when the U.S. took Fallujah, I think it was in 2006. It took them like Fallujah's. I mean, I'm sure you know, Fallujah is a small town, but the U.S. spent a lot of time, like almost 6 months, because they wanted to follow the ethical code. They didn't want to kill like everybody. They want to have less civilian casualties, but at the same time, it took them 6 months, and they lost a lot of their own casualties. They lost a lot of soldiers, and they lost a lot of like equipment. So that was a little bit frustrating for the U.S. military. But in the same time, when in Syria, like I see the Russian, for example, if you want to take the same size of the town, they will probably take it in 2 days, which is they did because they just bomb everything and they kill everybody. So do you think in the future, the U.S. maybe will change their, maybe the U.S. military, they will change their ethical code. They will maybe looking for, I understand they have an ethical code to follow, but do you think that will be changed in the future? Do you think they're looking for more results, fast results, and less soldier casualties than the other civilian in that area?
Well, the answer in my mind is no, absolutely not. Won't change. I mean, there were two battles of Fallujah. There was April of 2004, November of 2004. And in the second battle, the U.S. forces made they were Marine forces, but there were Army units there and Iraqi units. They made every effort to get all the civilians out. So they knew that the only people that were left were, Al-Qaeda. And they did destroy a lot of the city, but they tried to do it methodically as they could and not, burn down the forest, to protect the tree. That said, I mean, this last fight against ISIS, the same thing. Mosul was basically decimated, and Ramadi suffered extreme casualties out in Anbar, and it needs to get rebuilt. And we could talk more and more about that. I mean, I don't, I still remember the people that live in Anbar, the Iraqi people, and the great, it's like most of them, hey, they're just trying to go on to get on with their lives and try to have a better way to do things. But to answer your question, do I think the United States will ever become less discriminatory and more open and allow less responsiveness or less concern about rules of engagement and civilian casualties and collateral damage? At this point, I would say no. Now, things could always change. I mean, previously, in World War II, there were, you look at there's still discussion. We talk about, the use of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, firebombing of Dresden, and, huge numbers of civilian casualties. But because of the capabilities we have now, we can be much more precise. But that doesn't mean that we're perfect. But to your question, do I think we would adopt a policy like the Russian military did in Idlib and other places in and around in Syria? No, I do not believe that's going to happen.
Professor Gartsky.
And I would certainly not recommend that.
Professor Gartsky, if you'll kind of put a bow around it, and then we'll let the general get on with his day. There's a bunch of questions that are going to go unasked, and I apologize for that. Again, this is probably the most active participation in our speaker series that I've seen in a long time. Professor
Well, Robert, I don't want to put more work on you, but I mean, if you want to collect them and send them to me, I'll do my best to answer them and then send them back to you.
That would be great.